Alright, so we're back with another Assassin's Creed Shadows video, and I thought it would be apt to test an Intel Arc B580, seeing that the game is sponsored by Intel, right? So currently we've got this B580 paired with a 12400F CPU. Now it's a more entry-level CPU, but then again the budget for this GPU costs $250 MSRP, right? So people would probably be pairing it with a more budget CPU, and that is paired with 32 gigabytes of a DDR4 3600 megatransfers per second CL18 memory. Right, so currently we are I'm not even getting 30 frames per second yet, but let me show you the settings. I'm going to make this video short. I know. I keep on saying it, but I never do it. I do apologize. So 1080p, and we are using XeSS native. This game supports XeSS 2.0, so we can actually use XeSS Frame Generation here. And scalability, I've put everything on ultra high, right? So it's the ultra high preset with all ray tracing options enabled. I just want to start off with it. Okay. Just to give you an idea, performance is quite rough, but it is to be expected. That I'm not shocked that we aren't getting 30 frames per second at all times, right? So if the recording looks a little bit choppy, it's because we are only getting 30 frames per second, right? I am using an external capture card for all my recordings, and anything below 60 frames per second looks a bit choppy. Okay, so 30-ish frames per second here. I'm back in the same scene where I was earlier, at the same spot. So I just want to see if we can get some decent performance here. I doubt it, right? Because just one thing, native AA is 100% render resolution scale, right? So quality for XeSS is 35% of the total resolution, whereas DLSS quality is like 44-45%, right? So just keep note that the DLSS, the XeSS quality presets are actually lower than FSR and DLSS. Let me show you. If we go to FSR, so quality is 44%, balance is 35%, and performance is 25%, right? But if we use XeSS, this is normal, right? So XeSS quality is 35%, so it's the same as balanced. Then balanced is the same as performance, and then performance is even lower. All right, so let's start off with the I'm going to do XeSS quality, the same settings. Just want to see if we can actually get closer to 60 frames per second, but I highly doubt that we will. Okay, so the game still feels okay-ish, right? Even though the frame time is a little bit more erratic than on the previous system, the 5080, the frame times really feel okay. But let's not waste too much time. That's not going to happen. Let's just go straight to XeSS performance. Let's see. 20% render resolution scale, I mean 20% of the total amount of pixels, so, and that gets us 40 frames per second, so we gained literally nothing. Okay, the game looks terrible with these 1080p with performance XeSS, but unfortunately that's the way it is, right? We saw scaling not working at all previously as well, or not really good at all. So let's just show you XeSS. I hate it when it stops scrolling. XeSS Frame Generation. This is XeSS 2.0, which is actually quite good. And let's just see what happens when we have a base frame rate of 40-ish frames per second. We now have 65 frames per second. Surprisingly enough, let me just restart we can't really capture the lows again because it's the same as the DLSS. That's the wrong button. It's the same as the DLSS frame generation, the newer model. You can't really capture it with the on-screen display metrics. All right, so you can get 60 frames per second, but you have to use frame generation. And sure, we are using maxed out settings, although we are using performance scaling. I must say the input latency actually feels okay. Like this is surprisingly responsive. Very, very strange. But using a controller would be better, right? So I think let me just disable ray tracing here. Let me just show you. Previously we tested without ray tracing as well on the 5080, and the performance differences weren't really that much. All right. So you can see we went from 66 frames per second to 77 frames per second. The lighting looks horrible though, and we really didn't gain that much. Ray tracing in this game is not that hard to run, and it's not the setting that is bringing the performance down as much as it is. The game is just very heavy. I'm going to reload my save because it is getting dark, but then, I mean, we need to restart the game for our settings to apply as well, because let's drop it down to the high preset. We'll use ray tracing anyway, but let's drop it down to the high preset and see what happens. Alright, so we are back in the game. XeSS native AA, and we have the high preset instead of the ultra very high preset, and we do not have frame generation enabled. And I reloaded my save, or the game had to restart, and still we're getting 50-ish frames per second in this specific spot, 45 actually, and it's just going to get worse down there, right? So once again, even the preset scaling at 1080p on this GPU really doesn't make a difference. Even on the ultra high preset, we were seeing between, what was it, the high 20s, mid to low 30s. And sure, now we are constantly staying above 30 frames per second, but it really did not make that big a difference. And I'm not even going to do the full run here. It's kind of disappointing, because people with lower end GPUs like this, what are we supposed to do to get the performance to be on acceptable levels, right? So let's go, and I'm going to drop down all the way to performance again. It's not going to make that big a difference. Okay, let's see how close we get to 60. All right, so 55 frames per second. It's just not going to cut it, and it looks horrible. There's no reason for anybody to play the game like this, right? We saw 60 there, very surprising. So the only other thing that we can do is drop the preset. And I mean, as we saw earlier, we gain around 10 frames per second with ray tracing disabled, but there's no way that you're going to play on DLSS or XeSS performance at 1080p. So let's drop this down to medium and actually see what happens. Alright, so on the medium preset, once again, 50-ish frames per second at the top here, going to drop down, and we are going to be in the high 30s probably again. Like, this is, it's heavy, maybe we're getting closer to 50. Alright, so mid 40s, that's a definite improvement over over 30 frames per second. Although the input latency really feels okay for some reason, even on lower frame rates. I don't know how they do that, but the input latency feels okay. So 47-ish frames per second here. Let's see. I'm going to disable ray tracing first. I hope the game doesn't want to restart again, because in my previous video, I'll link it in the description. Sometimes you have to restart the game, sometimes you have to reload a save, sometimes you don't have to do anything, and I don't know which is which. So 1080p medium, we are, let me reset the numbers here quickly. We're still not hitting constant 60 frames per second, although it is definitely a much better experience, I'd say. It's consistent, at least. Like the 1% to 0.1% lows are pretty decent even on a system like this. It feels good, I have to say. I'm not a 60 frames per second gamer. I do, since I got my first high refresh rate monitor, it's been a struggle for me to go back, but this doesn't feel bad at all. And like it does start to look a little bit flat here on the medium preset without ray tracing, right? Definitely a big visual difference over when we do use ray tracing. So let's just try some quality upscaling, 35%. So basically FSR balanced, okay, would be the equivalent here. And now we are seeing some scaling happening here, and if we reset our numbers, I'm just going to run to the top there. At the top there, when we turn around, that is when it was dropping quite a lot below 60 frames per second. I want to see if we maintain 60 frames per second here. Alright, okay, so this is what you need to do. Medium preset with XeSS set to quality, and you'll get 60 frames per second probably all of the time. I'm not sure other areas of the game, if it is more demanding. I haven't had time yet to progress. actually waiting for a patch or two to see if the performance improves before I dive into this game. But now with XeSS quality enabled, I want to see what happens if we enable ray tracing. I did cover all the ray tracing settings in the previous video, so give that a watch if you haven't already. And waiting. All right. So what I did see is on the medium preset, just look at the water now. The ray traced reflections, etc., on the water look pretty bad when we have the medium preset enabled. Actually, the water looks better without ray tracing when you use the medium preset. Just look at that. Those aren't artifacts. This is what it looks like. I saw it on the 5080 as well. So, but we are actually able to almost maintain. This looks bad. 60 frames per second. In this case, when we have to use medium preset, I probably would tell you to not use ray tracing, or sorry, let me go back. I'm wasting time here, but I want to see if we can improve the water quality here without losing too much of the frame rate. Just it looks bad, but it happens on the 5080 as well with the DLSS, so it's not exclusive to the XeSS upscaling or GPU here. What I want to do is I want to see if we up this to medium. I hope the game doesn't want to reboot. Oh, okay, it only wants to reload the save. That's better. But it would be better if it didn't, if we could actually just see comparisons, right? Now every time it just comes back here. So let me just, whoops. All right, so 58 frames per second down here, up here again. We might be slightly below 60 frames per second down here, but I do think we should see better water. I hope. Definitely much better. Like, it's a massive improvement, and like we also lost like 20% of our performance here, unfortunately. But as I said, the input latency feels perfectly fine. I'm playing with a keyboard and mouse here, and if you use a controller, it'll be even less noticeable, right? So what if we then enable XeSS Frame Generation, if I can find it? So let me show you one thing quickly. If we enable FSR Frame Generation, yeah, what I saw earlier was that XeSS actually has less overhead here in this game when we use it. So the input latency is very noticeable now. Definitely much worse than before, because now we're basically with the overhead of FSR Frame Generation, we are now seeing a base frame rate of 35-ish frames per second, and it's noticeable. It's very noticeable in the input latency. I wish I could show you the input latency. I haven't figured out all the Intel stuff yet. There's probably a way, but I haven't figured it out, sorry. So if we go and use XeSS Frame Generation, yeah, we should see a bit of a higher frame rate. And let's see. You see, now we're getting almost 100 frames per second. Now XeSS and the input latency is, I mean, it's much better. It's very strange, not strange, because XeSS is exclusive to Intel Arc GPUs, so it's definitely leveraging the Arc architecture better than what FSR can, and it looks good, it runs okay, and the input latency is definitely much better. This feels like a native 60 frames per second input latency. I'm not going to lie, it definitely feels much better. Once again, the lows really not accurate here. Okay, I just wanted to record the average as well, so just disregard the lows, because you can see the frame time graph is that thick and it's just not accurate. All right, so this is where we're going to end it at 1080p, and these are the settings you have to use if you want to get a playable experience. Not horrible, but not perfect either. All right, let's move on to 1440p. All right, we're now at 1440p on the medium preset. Exactly the same settings we used in the last section of the video, 1080p, purely because that was the only setting that would get us around 60-ish frames per second, right? And that's what I'm targeting. I know a lot of people are fine with 30 frames per second. Others are fine with 40 frames per second. Others can't stand 60 frames per second even. For me, 60 is minimum, and think well, that's what I'm testing, to try and achieve 60 frames per second here, right? Except we're not using upscaling or frame generation, but we are just using medium preset, basically with medium ray traced quality, etc. And then we've got no upscaling. So let's go ahead and see if quality upscaling helps here. It actually did previously on the medium preset. So 50-ish frames per second. This specific spot here seems to be a little bit more demanding in my run, right? So 50-ish frames per second. If we go up here, we should be able to get 50 plus, right? And that's really okay. So 45-ish frames per second. It's not that good. And one thing we can do is just a drop down to balanced here, which is actually performance upscaling. And let's just see, like the thing is, I know you can get above 60 frames per second once you enable frame generation here, but it's really not that good of an experience when your base frame rate is low. That's actually the first time I've seen another person my benchmark run in this path, on this path here. So still 50-ish frames per second, really not that big a difference upscaling. So unfortunately, this is probably the best it's going to get at 1440p for you if you do have this GPU and a 1440p monitor. So only other thing we can probably do here is apply frame generation. I'm going to start off with the FSR. I just want to see if the differences are as big at 1440p as well. It should be. Okay, we can actually just get rid of all the lows because it doesn't really work with the XeSS. So 70-ish frames per second, let's call it. And then if we go ahead and then just use XeSS, want to see what the performance, apply and save. All right, let's see what the difference in the frame rate is. So it's actually quite a lot better. So 15 frames per second more. So, and it feels responsive enough. I wouldn't mind playing like this at all if I was aiming for 60 frames per second. I know it sounds very contradictory because I personally aim to try and get at least 120 frames per second when I do use frame generation, purely because of the input latency, and also there are less, the artifacts are less noticeable at a higher frame rate, right? Because they occupy screen time a lot less screen time. Okay, so they come and go very quickly, and there's also smaller differences between frames. So that's why I aim for around 120 frames per second. But this actually looks and feels pretty good. I'm not gonna lie. This is not horrible, but I think that's probably the best you're going to get at 1440p, unless you drop down to the low preset, which I don't think it's worth it. So I'm going to test the two ray trace settings here. Wow, we actually had to restart the game for that setting to take effect. That's very, very strange. I believe you can disable it completely and it doesn't require a restart, but just switching it to diffuse only, you need to restart the game. That's very strange. So 90-ish frames per second here. We gained a little bit, not that much, but the game still looks pretty good, right? The lighting really in this game is very well done and doesn't look as flat, right? I think this is okay-ish, 80 frames per second. Like, here's the thing, you got no other choice, right? So sure, when you tell people you're doing 80 frames per second with frame generation enabled, they'll tell you it's a horrible experience, but what other choice do you have if you want to play this game? So let's go ahead and just disable ray tracing completely. Remember, this says diffuse hideout only. It means that in the world, ray tracing is disabled, okay? It's only enabled in your hideout. So let's go ahead, and now we're getting 100 something frames per second. This is, I think this is doable. So this would be around 50-ish frames per second without any frame generation. So it's still less than 60, obviously. But it's not bad. It's really not bad. But I do think the performance penalty with ray tracing is really not that big. But her face just looks very flat and yellow, and I don't know. I do not like the look of the characters, in particular in shadowy areas, when ray tracing is disabled. So for me personally, the small, and it is a small hit when you, this performance hit when you enable ray tracing, I think it is worth it in this game. Alright, I think that's going to be the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.